My wife left me with our daughter when she was 9 and returned to us with a new father when my daughter was 20. At her wedding, she chose the new father over me, who had raised her for 11 years. I never thought my life would be defined by a series of unexpected goodbyes and even more startling reunions. But here I am, 53 years old, sitting in a too-quiet house that used to echo with laughter and the occasional slammed door. My name is Henry, and for the last 2 decades, my life has been a swirling mess of love, betrayal, and resilience. It all began when Sarah, my ex-wife, walked out on me and our daughter, Melanie. Melanie was just 9 at the time, a sweet girl with big brown eyes and a laugh that could light up a room. Sarah and I had our share of problems, sure, but I never saw her leaving as an option. Then one day, she packed a suitcase, kissed Melanie on the forehead, and walked out the door. She didn't even bother to explain. Just a simple, "I need to find myself, Henry." Find herself? What the hell did that even mean? I was left to pick up the pieces, both of my heart and Melanie's shattered world. It wasn't easy. I was working long hours as a mechanic, barely making ends meet, and now I had to learn how to braid hair, pack school lunches, and attend every parent-teacher conference without breaking down. But we managed. Melanie and I became a team, partners against the world. For 11 years, it was just the two of us. Melanie grew into a smart, independent young woman. She had her rebellious phase, of course, purple hair, questionable boyfriends, and late-night parties. But she always came back to me. We had each other, and that was enough. Until it wasn't. I'll never forget the day Sarah came back. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind where the clouds hang low, and the streets glisten with puddles. I was in the garage, elbow-deep in a carburetor, when the doorbell rang. Melanie, then 20 and home for summer break from college, got to it before I did. I heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by a tense, "What are you doing here?" I wiped my hands on a rag and walked to the door, my heart pounding. And there she was, Sarah. She looked older, thinner, her once vivid auburn hair now streaked with gray. Standing next to her was a man I didn't recognize, tall and impeccably dressed, his arm protectively around her waist. "Henry," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "I'm here to see my daughter." Her daughter? She hadn't even called Melanie once in the past 11 years, and now she wanted to waltz back into her life like nothing had happened? I was furious, but Melanie, always the more forgiving one, agreed to let her in. We sat in the living room, an awkward triangle of emotions, while Sarah tried to explain. "I know I made mistakes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was selfish, but I've changed. Brian helped me see that." Brian. That was the man's name. Her new husband. He nodded politely, his face a mask of calm. Melanie listened quietly, her face unreadable. When Sarah finally finished her long-winded apology, Melanie stood up, her voice cold. "You can't just show up and expect everything to be okay. You abandoned me. You left Dad to do everything. Do you have any idea what that did to us?" Sarah broke down, sobbing into Brian's shoulder. I wanted to comfort Melanie, but she stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. That night, I found her sitting on her bed, staring at an old photo of the three of us from happier times. She didn't look up when I entered. "Do you want to see her again?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "I don't know. Part of me hates her, but another part of me, I guess I want to understand why." Over the next few months, Sarah kept trying. She sent letters, texts, and even flowers. Melanie, ever curious, finally agreed to meet her for lunch. They began to rebuild their relationship, slowly and cautiously. I stayed out of it, letting Melanie make her own decisions. But I couldn't help feeling like an outsider in my own family. Then came the bombshell. One evening, Melanie came home looking pale and shaken. She handed me a letter, her hands trembling. It was from Sarah. As I read it, my blood ran cold. The letter wasn't just an apology, it was a confession. Sarah admitted that when she left us, it wasn't just to find herself. She'd fallen in love with someone else, someone dangerous. There were hints of abuse, manipulation, and threats. She had run to protect us, she claimed, fearing that her lover would hurt us if she stayed. I didn't know what to believe. Was this the truth, or just another excuse? I showed the letter to Melanie, who was equally torn. Do you think she's lying again? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. But we need to be careful. Sarah's reappearance didn't just bring confusion. It brought chaos. Brian, her new husband, started showing up uninvited, asking to talk things over like adults. There was something about him I didn't trust. He was too polished, too perfect, always saying the right thing. Melanie noticed it too. One night, after dinner, Melanie pulled me aside. Dad, do you think Brian knows about the letter? I hadn't thought about it, but the possibility sent a chill down my spine. If he did, why hadn't he mentioned it? What was he hiding? The next day, Melanie confronted Sarah. Did you tell Brian about the letter? Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. No, she said finally. It's better if he doesn't know. That was the moment everything started to unravel. Melanie had always been my pride and joy, so when she announced her engagement, I was over the moon. Her fiancé, Ethan, seemed like a solid guy, polite, hardworking, and completely smitten with her. I wasn't the type to meddle in her love life, but after everything we'd been through, it was reassuring to know she was marrying someone who would treat her well. The wedding planning started almost immediately. Melanie threw herself into it with her characteristic determination. She wanted it all: the perfect dress, a beautiful venue, a 5-course dinner for over 100 guests. It didn't come cheap. When she showed me the budget, my eyes nearly popped out of my head. $50,000? Mel, are you sure this is what you want? I asked, my voice tight with concern. Dad, it's a once-in-a-lifetime event, she said, her eyes shining with excitement. I want it to be special. How could I say no to that? I had some savings set aside and decided I could contribute half, $25,000. It wasn't easy, but seeing Melanie's face light up when I handed her the check made it worth it. I told myself this was what being a father was about, making sacrifices so your child could be happy. The planning process was hectic. Melanie and Ethan argued over the guest list, the cake flavors, and whether or not to include a live band. I stayed out of it, letting them figure things out on their own. But as the weeks went on, I noticed a growing presence in the planning process: Brian. At first, I tried to ignore it. He'd show up to meetings with the florist or make suggestions about the seating arrangements. Melanie seemed to value his input, which made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to insert himself into something that wasn't his place. Then came the bombshell. It was a quiet Sunday evening. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, when Melanie walked in, looking nervous. She sat down next to me, fiddling with the hem of her sweater. Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about, she began. Sure, kiddo. What's on your mind? She hesitated, biting her lip. I've been thinking about the wedding, and I've decided I want Brian to walk me down the aisle. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. What did you just say? I want Brian to walk me down the aisle, she repeated, her voice trembling. You've both been such important parts of my life, and I feel like it's the right thing to do. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Melanie, I raised you. I've been there for you every step of the way. And now you're telling me you want him to take my place. It's not like that, Dad, she said quickly. You'll still be there. I don't want to hurt his feelings. He's been so supportive, and what about my feelings? I interrupted, my voice rising. Do you have any idea what this feels like for me? After everything I've done for you? Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I couldn't back down. This wasn't just about walking her down the aisle. It was about everything Brian represented. He was a reminder of Sarah, of the years of pain and abandonment we'd endured. And now he was trying to take the one role that was mine. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and awkward conversations. Melanie and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained. Sarah, of course, had to weigh in. She called me one evening, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Henry, I know this is hard for you, but Melanie's decision isn't about you, she said. It's about what makes her happy. Spare me the lecture, Sarah. I snapped. You don't get to tell me what's best for my daughter. You lost that right years ago. Brian, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the chaos he'd caused. He continued to show up to planning meetings, acting as if everything was perfectly fine. I wanted to confront him, to tell him to back off, but I knew it would only make things worse. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any more complicated, I discovered something that changed everything. It happened by accident. I was cleaning out the garage, trying to distract myself from the wedding drama, when I found an old box of papers. Inside were some documents from the divorce, including a letter from Sarah's lawyer. As I skimmed through it, something caught my eye, a mention of a bank account I didn't recognize. Curious, I did some digging. What I found left me reeling. The account had been opened in Sarah's name shortly before she left, and it had a substantial amount of money in it. Money that had been deposited by Brian. The timeline didn't add up. Sarah had claimed she met Brian years after she left us, but this proved otherwise. They'd been involved while we were still married. And if that wasn't bad enough, the money in the account raised even more questions. Where had it come from? And why had she kept it hidden? I didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront Sarah and demand answers, but another part of me feared what I might uncover. Instead, I decided to focus on the wedding. I couldn't let this distract me from what really mattered, my relationship with Melanie. The wedding day arrived sooner than I expected. The venue was stunning, the decorations flawless. Melanie looked radiant in her dress, and Ethan couldn't stop grinning. But I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach as I watched Brian take his place beside her. When it was time for the ceremony, I stood in the back, watching as Brian walked her down the aisle. I felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak, knowing that this moment should have been mine. After the ceremony, Melanie came up to me, her eyes shining with tears. "Thank you for being here, Dad," she said. "I know this wasn't easy for you." I hugged her tightly, my emotions too tangled to put into words. "I'll always be here for you, Mel, no matter what." After the wedding, life didn't settle the way I hoped. Melanie and I hadn't been the same since she chose Brian to walk her down the aisle. The decision felt like a knife in my chest, twisting every time I thought about it. I tried to focus on the positives. She was married now, happy, and building a life with Ethan. But the distance between us was undeniable. I realized I couldn't carry this weight any longer. If I wanted things to improve, I needed to talk to her. Really talk. I couldn't just pretend I was okay with everything. So, I invited her to dinner at our favorite diner, a small, cozy spot called Gracie's that we'd been going to since she was a kid. I hoped the familiar surroundings would make it easier to open up. She arrived right on time, her smile warm but cautious. Melanie always had a way of sensing when something was wrong. She slid into the booth across from me, her dark hair framing her face, and looked at me expectantly. "What's up, Dad? You sounded serious on the phone." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Mel, I need to talk to you about something that's been on my mind for a while." Her expression shifted, a hint of concern creeping into her eyes. "Okay." I didn't sugarcoat it. "I want to talk about the wedding. About Brian walking you down the aisle." Her shoulders tensed, and she looked down at the table, fiddling with her fork. "Dad, we've been through this. It wasn't meant to hurt you." "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But it did. Melanie, I raised you. I was there for every scraped knee, every school play, every late-night phone call when you needed someone to talk to. Walking you down the aisle was something I always dreamed of. And when you gave that role to Brian," my voice cracked, "it felt like I wasn't enough." Her eyes welled with tears, and for a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she sighed and shook her head. "Dad, you were enough. You are enough. But this wasn't about replacing you." "Then what was it about?" I pressed. "Because from where I'm standing, it felt like you chose him over me." She hesitated, chewing on her lip like she always did when she was nervous. "It was Mom," she admitted finally. "She kept saying that having Brian involved would make the wedding happier, more harmonious. She thought it would show that we're all one big, happy family now." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. "So this was Sarah's idea? She convinced you to do this?" Melanie nodded, guilt etched across her face. "She said it would mean a lot to him. And honestly, I thought, maybe she was right. I thought it would be the kind thing to do." I leaned back in my seat, struggling to process what she was telling me. Sarah. Of course it was her. It wasn't enough for her to waltz back into our lives after abandoning us. She had to rewrite history, too. Make it look like she and Brian had always been there for Melanie, like they were part of the family all along. Mel, I understand wanting to make people happy, I said carefully. But at what cost? Did you ever stop to think about how this would make me feel? About what it meant to me? I did, she said quietly. But I didn't know how to make everyone happy. I thought you'd understand. Her words stung, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was caught in the middle of a mess Sarah had created. Still, it didn't make it any easier to swallow. Our conversation was interrupted when the waitress brought our food. I barely touched mine, too lost in thought. Melanie poked at her salad, avoiding my gaze. After a long silence, I spoke again. Melanie, I need you to understand something. I've never asked for much. All I've ever wanted was to be there for you, to support you, no matter what. But this felt like you were erasing everything we've been through together. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. Dad, no, I would never do that. I know you didn't mean to, I said, but that's how it felt. And I need you to see things from my perspective. Because if we don't talk about this, if we don't fix this, I'm afraid it's going to come between us. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she reached across the table to grab my hand. I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't think about it like that. I was just trying to keep the peace. I know, I said, squeezing her hand. But sometimes, keeping the peace isn't worth losing the people who matter most. After dinner, we walked to the parking lot together. Melanie hugged me tightly, holding on as if she was afraid to let go. I love you, Dad, she whispered. I hope you know that. I love you too, kiddo, I said. And I always will. As I watched her drive away, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. We'd taken a step toward healing, but the scars were still there. And deep down, I knew the real issue wasn't just about the wedding. It was about Sarah. She had a way of sowing discord, of pitting people against each other without even trying. If I wanted to protect my relationship with Melanie, I'd have to find a way to deal with Sarah once and for all. After my conversation with Melanie, I thought things might settle, but they didn't. Days passed, and the weight of the wedding loomed heavier on my chest. Every time I replayed our talk, the pain of her decision gnawed at me. She had chosen Brian to walk her down the aisle because Sarah thought it would create some twisted illusion of harmony. But what about me? What about the years I spent pouring every ounce of myself into raising Melanie? It felt like my role as her father was being erased, and I couldn't bear it. The tipping point came one evening when I was sorting through old family photos. I found one of Melanie and me at her high school graduation. Her face was lit with pride as she held her diploma, and I stood beside her, my arm around her shoulder, beaming. That moment had felt like a culmination of everything we'd endured together. I'd been there for every milestone, every challenge. And now, at her wedding, the biggest moment of her life, I was supposed to take a back seat? I couldn't do it. I wouldn't. The next day, I called my sister Julia. She'd always been the voice of reason in our family, the one who could see things clearly even when emotions ran high. Julia was 10 years younger than me, a no-nonsense lawyer with a sharp mind and a heart of gold. If anyone could understand what I was going through, it was her. When she picked up, I got straight to the point. Jules, I'm not going to the wedding. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a sigh. Henry, are you sure that's the right decision? I've never been more sure of anything, I said. I can't stand there and pretend everything's fine when I feel like I've been pushed aside. Julia didn't respond immediately. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. Look, she said finally, I get that you're hurt, and you have every right to be. But this is Melanie's wedding. It's one day, Henry. One day to rise above all the crap and be there for your daughter. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. It's not just one day, Julia. It's a statement. By letting Brian take my place, she's saying that everything I've done for her doesn't matter. How can I support that? Henry, she said, her tone softer now. You're her father. No one can take that away from you. Not Brian, not Sarah. But if you don't go, you'll regret it. Trust me. Her words hit a nerve, but I couldn't bring myself to agree. I've made up my mind, I said firmly. I'm not going. Julia didn't give up easily. She showed up at my house 2 days later, unannounced, armed with coffee and her usual determination. She sat me down at the kitchen table and launched into a full-blown intervention. Henry, you're being stubborn, she said bluntly. And I say that with love. It's not stubbornness, I countered. It's principle. Principle? She raised an eyebrow. Henry, principles are great, but they don't keep relationships intact. Melanie needs you there, whether she realizes it or not. She's made her choice, I said, my voice tight. She chose Brian. No, Julia said, leaning forward. She chose to try and make everyone happy. That doesn't mean she loves you any less. I wanted to believe her, but the wound was too fresh. You don't understand, Jules. You've never had to raise a kid on your own. You've never had to give up everything for someone, only to feel like it was all for nothing. She reached across the table and placed a hand on mine. You're right. I don't understand what that's like, but I do understand that love isn't always fair. Sometimes you have to swallow your pride and show up, even when it hurts. Her words stayed with me long after she left. I replayed them over and over in my mind, trying to decide if she was right. But every time I thought about standing in that church, watching Brian take my place, my stomach twisted in knots. No matter how much I loved Melanie, I couldn't do it. Not like this. The week before the wedding, I called Melanie to tell her my decision. She answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful. Hey, Dad. What's up? I took a deep breath. Mel, I need to talk to you about the wedding. Her tone shifted instantly. Okay. I'm not coming, I said, my voice steady but firm. I can't do it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. Why? You know why, I said. Melanie, I love you more than anything, but I can't stand there and watch someone else take my place. It's too much. Dad, it's not about replacing you, she said, her voice breaking. I told you that. I know you think that, I said, but that's not how it feels to me. And I need you to understand that. Her breath hitched, and I realized she was crying. So you're just not going to be there? On the most important day of my life. I wish it didn't have to be this way, I said, my heart aching. But I can't pretend to be okay with something that hurts me this much. She didn't respond, and after a few moments, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling a mix of guilt and resolve. I knew I'd hurt her, but I also knew I couldn't betray my own feelings. In the days leading up to the wedding, I heard from everyone. Sarah, Brian, even Ethan. They all tried to convince me to change my mind. Sarah's call was particularly infuriating. Henry, you're being ridiculous, she said. This is about Melanie, not you. Funny how you're the one saying that. I shot back. Considering this whole mess started with your suggestion. Don't pin this on me, she snapped. Melanie made her own decision. You're the one who's choosing to make it about yourself. I hung up on her before I said something I'd regret. As much as I wanted to yell and scream, I knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. When the wedding day arrived, I stayed home. I tried to distract myself, cleaning the house, working in the yard, but nothing could shake the heaviness in my chest. Around noon, Julia called to check on me. How are you holding up? She asked. Fine, I lied. Henry, her voice was filled with concern. You still have time to change your mind. I'm not changing my mind, I said firmly. She sighed. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're making a mistake. But I hope you find some peace in your decision. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room, staring at the clock. I imagined Melanie walking down the aisle, her face glowing with happiness. I imagined the look on Brian's face as he walked beside her, taking the role that should have been mine. And for the first time, I wondered if Julia was right. Had I made a mistake? Had I let my pride get in the way of being there for my daughter? But it was too late now. The wedding was already happening, and I was miles away. The days after Melanie's wedding were some of the loneliest I'd ever experienced. I tried not to think about the ceremony, about the moment she walked down the aisle with Brian at her side instead of me. But the image haunted me, cropping up at the most unexpected moments. A flash of bitterness when I poured my morning coffee, a pang of regret as I flipped through TV channels late at night. I knew I'd made my choice, and I didn't regret it. Not really. But the aftermath was suffocating. Melanie hadn't called since the wedding, and I hadn't reached out either. The silence between us was heavier than I'd imagined. Julia, ever the peacemaker, tried to bridge the gap. She stopped by my house one afternoon, her expression a mix of determination and disappointment. "Henry, you have to talk to her," she said, sitting across from me in the living room. "This can't go on." "She made her decision," I replied, my voice flat. "She chose Brian. What's left to say?" Julia leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "She didn't choose Brian over you. She was trying to balance everything. You know how Melanie is. She always wants to make everyone happy. Well, she failed," I shot back. "Because I'm not happy, Julia. I spent 20 years giving her everything I had, and she threw it all away for a man she's known for a fraction of that time." Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're being dramatic." "Am I?" I snapped. "Because it doesn't feel dramatic to me. It feels like the truth." That conversation planted a seed in my mind, one that grew into something darker as the days went by. I started to think about my legacy, about what I would leave behind when I was gone. For years, I'd always assumed everything I had would go to Melanie. My house, my savings, everything I'd worked for. But now, I wasn't so sure. The thoughts simmered in the back of my mind until one evening when I found myself sitting at my desk, staring at my will. The document was straightforward. Everything went to Melanie. It was what I'd wanted for so long, what I'd built my life around. But now, it felt wrong. Why should I leave her everything when she had already chosen someone else to fill the role I'd spent years trying to perfect? Before I could talk myself out of it, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, Dennis. He was an old friend, someone I trusted to handle this delicate matter. Dennis listened patiently as I explained what I wanted to do. "You're sure about this, Henry?" he asked, his tone careful. "Positive," I replied. "She made her choice, and now I'm making mine." A week later, I met with Dennis at his office to finalize the changes. We went through the document line by line, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness as I signed my name at the bottom. Melanie was no longer the sole beneficiary. Instead, I decided to leave the bulk of my estate, $400,000, to charity. The house and a few smaller assets would go to Julia, who had always been there for me when I needed her most. As I left Dennis's office, I felt a sense of closure. For the first time in weeks, the anger and bitterness subsided, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I had done what I needed to do to protect myself, to reclaim a sense of control over my life. The peace didn't last long. A few days later, Julia called me, her voice tense. "Henry, we need to talk." "What is it?" I asked, already bracing myself for bad news. "It's Melanie," she said. "She knows about the will." My stomach dropped. "How?" "She was at my house yesterday, and—" "I slipped," Julia admitted, her voice heavy with guilt. "She was upset about not hearing from you, and I thought she had a right to know." "Julia," I said, my voice sharp, "that wasn't your decision to make." "I know," she said quickly. "But Henry, she's devastated. You need to talk to her." I didn't have time to process Julia's words before my phone started ringing off the hook. Melanie called me 5 times that day, each time leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. "Dad, please call me back. I need to talk to you." "Dad, Julia told me about the will. Is it true? Did you cut me out?" "Dad, I don't understand why you're doing this. Please just call me." I couldn't bring myself to answer. Each message felt like a dagger to the chest, reopening wounds I thought I'd started to heal. But I wasn't ready to face her, not yet. The next day, Melanie showed up at my house. I heard her car pull into the driveway and peeked out the window to see her standing on the porch, her arms crossed and her face set with determination. She knocked on the door, her voice calling out, "Dad, I know you're in there. Please let me in." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to open it, to let her in and finally hash things out. But another part of me, the part still clinging to my anger, couldn't do it. Instead, I stepped away from the door and sat down in the living room, my heart pounding. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, and I heard her footsteps retreat. I thought she'd left, but then her voice came through the window, muffled but clear. "Dad, I'm not leaving until you talk to me," I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I knew she meant it. Melanie had always been stubborn, a trait she'd inherited from me. I couldn't ignore her forever. When I finally opened the door, Melanie's face was a mix of relief and frustration. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What the hell, Dad?" she said, her voice trembling. "How could you do this?" I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to find the right words. "Melanie, you have to understand." "No," she interrupted. "You have to understand. I'm your daughter, Dad. I love you, and I thought you loved me too." "Of course I love you," I said, my voice cracking. "But love doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't change the fact that you chose Brian over me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't choosing him over you. I was trying to include him because he's part of my life now. That doesn't mean you're not my dad." "Then why did it feel that way?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why did it feel like everything I'd done for you, everything we'd been through, didn't matter?" "It does matter," she cried. "You matter. But you're punishing me for trying to make peace with Mom and Brian, and it's not fair." We argued for what felt like hours, each of us unloading years of hurt and resentment. By the end, we were both exhausted, sitting across from each other in silence. I could see the pain in her eyes, and I knew she could see it in mine. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said softly. "I just wanted everyone to be happy." "I know," I said, "and I didn't mean to hurt you, either. But I needed to protect myself, Mel. I needed to take back some control." "So where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we need to figure it out together." It had been a few days since Melanie stormed out of my house after our fight about the will. I thought maybe we'd reached some sort of uneasy truce. I wasn't expecting forgiveness, nor was I ready to offer it. But I figured the storm had passed, at least for the time being. I was wrong. Late one evening, my phone buzzed. I picked it up and saw Melanie's name flashing on the screen. For a moment, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But something in me, the part that still longed for reconciliation, compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice tired. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, her tone firm but with an undercurrent of vulnerability. "I can't keep going like this." "Then don't," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I told you how I feel, Melanie. I don't know what else there is to say." She hesitated, her voice softening. "Dad, I didn't mean to hurt you. I never thought my decisions would affect you like this. I didn't see them as hurtful." Her words hung in the air, but instead of bringing relief, they stoked a deep frustration within me. "Melanie, it's not just one decision," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "It's a series of actions that have made me feel unwanted, forgotten, like I was just a placeholder until something better came along." "That's not true," she exclaimed. "You've always been my dad, and nothing will ever change that." "Then why does it feel like it has?" I shot back. "You gave Brian a role that should have been mine. You let Sarah dictate the terms of your wedding. And when I said it hurt, you brushed it off like it didn't matter. Because I didn't know how to handle it," she cried. "I was trying to keep the peace, to make everyone happy. At my expense," I said coldly. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear her breathing, shaky and uneven. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. "I didn't mean for this to happen, but it did," I said. "And now, I have to live with the consequences. So do you." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. "It means if Brian was the father at the most important time in your life," I said, my words deliberate and heavy, "then let him continue to play that role." The line went silent again, but this time it was longer. When Melanie finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Is that really how you feel?" "Yes," I said, though the word felt like acid in my mouth. "It is." Without another word, she hung up. The days stretched into weeks, and I didn't hear from Melanie. At first, I told myself it was for the best. We both needed time to cool off, to reflect. But as the silence grew louder, a nagging doubt began to creep in. What if this wasn't temporary? What if the bond we'd spent decades building had been shattered for good? I busied myself with work around the house, fixing a leaky faucet in the bathroom, repainting the front porch. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memories. Everywhere I turned, there was something that reminded me of her. The family photos on the mantel, the half-finished jigsaw puzzle we'd started together last Christmas, the small dent in the kitchen table from the time she dropped her heavy college textbooks on it. Julia stopped by a few times, always with the same worried expression. "Have you talked to Melanie?" she asked during one visit. "No," I said simply. "Henry," she began, but I cut her off. "I know what you're going to say, Jules," I said, shaking my head. "And I don't want to hear it." "She's your daughter," Julia said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're both hurting, and the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be to fix." "Maybe it can't be fixed," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Julia looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "You don't mean that, don't I?" I asked, meeting her gaze. "She made her choice, Julia. She chose them over me. What am I supposed to do with that?" A few nights later, I found myself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing, replaying every argument, every painful word we'd exchanged. For the first time, I wondered if I'd been too harsh. Maybe Julia was right. Maybe I'd let my pride get in the way. But then I thought about the wedding, about the look on Brian's face as he walked Melanie down the aisle, and the bitterness came rushing back. The phone on my nightstand buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. I grabbed it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Melanie's name on the screen. But when I opened the message, it wasn't what I expected. It was a picture of her and Brian at the wedding, both of them smiling. The caption read, "Family isn't about blood. It's about love." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Was this her way of sending a message? Of saying she'd moved on? I wanted to reply, to say something, anything, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I set the phone down and turned off the light, feeling more alone than ever. The weeks turned into months, and still, there was no real contact. I heard bits and pieces from Julia, who assured me that Melanie was doing well but missed me. "She's just as stubborn as you are," Julia said one afternoon. "Neither of you wants to make the first move." "Maybe that's because I already made mine," I said, my tone bitter. "And she made hers." Julia sighed. "Henry, this isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about family. And if you don't find a way to move past this, you're going to lose her." "Maybe I already have," I said quietly. As time went on, I began to accept the possibility that Melanie and I might never reconcile. It was a painful realization, but one I couldn't ignore. I started to think about what my life would look like without her in it, about how I would fill the void she'd left behind. I threw myself into volunteer work, spending my weekends helping at a local food bank. It wasn't the same, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a way to channel my energy. Every now and then, I'd catch myself wondering if Melanie thought about me as much as I thought about her. Did she regret her decisions? Did she miss me? Or had she fully embraced her new family, leaving me behind for good? I might never know the answers to those questions. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the loss itself, but the uncertainty, the not knowing. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, I thought about the future, about what would happen when I was gone. Would Melanie look back on our relationship with regret? Or would she see me as the man who couldn't rise above his own pain? I didn't know. But as I stared at the flickering light of the fireplace, I made a silent vow. No matter what happened, I would hold onto the love I'd always had for her. Even if she never understood my decisions, even if our connection was broken forever, that love would remain. Because that's what it means to be a parent. To love, even when it hurts.